The wind howled through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, carrying dust and whispers with it. Every creak of the wooden boardwalk, every rustle of fabric as someone passed, reminded Clara Dawson of just how small she was in a town that had no place for her. Her father's death had left her with nothing, no family, no land, no money. Only a name that no one cared to remember and a spirit too stubborn to bend. Each morning, she rose before dawn to walk the mile into town, her threadbare shawl wrapped tight against the cold. She worked at Mr. Henley's general store, sweeping floors, stacking flour sacks, and running errands for less than $1 a day. Her hands were raw, her dress patched a dozen times, and her stomach rarely full. But she carried herself with quiet grace, as if daring the world to see her dignity instead of her poverty. Still, the whispers followed her. "Poor girl," the ladies said, pretending pity but dripping with scorn. "She should have married while her father was alive." The men laughed more openly, calling her the beggar girl, Henley's ragdoll, or worse. Clara tried not to let their words bite, but sometimes, when the day grew long and her body ached, she'd sneak behind the store and cry for a minute before drying her face and returning to work. Her father had been a good man, a ranch hand who believed that kindness was the only real wealth worth keeping. Before he died, he'd made her promise, "No matter what happens, Clara, don't ever bow to cruelty. You're not poor if you still have pride." She'd held on to those words as tightly as she held on to the locket he'd given her, the only thing of value she owned. That day, like many others, Clara tried to keep her head down. The afternoon sun burned hot, and she was sweeping the store's porch when a group of town girls passed by, all dressed in lace and ribbons. One of them, Millie Carter, smirked as she caught sight of Clara. "Careful, girls," she called out. "Don't let the dust from her broom touch you. It might be catching." Laughter rippled through the group. Clara paused, her grip tightening on the broom. She could have ignored them, she usually did, but something inside her snapped. Maybe it was hunger, or exhaustion, or the endless unfairness of it all. She lifted her chin and met Millie's gaze squarely. "You should worry less about dust and more about your own manners," she said quietly but firmly. The laughter stopped. Millie's face flushed red, and she sputtered, "You've got a sharp tongue for someone who can't afford a decent dress." Clara straightened, the wind tugging at her hair. "Maybe," she said, "but I'd rather have a sharp tongue than a cruel heart." With that, she turned and went back to her sweeping, her pulse pounding but her head held high. The street had fallen silent. Even the onlookers, accustomed to seeing her meek and quiet, watched her with new eyes. Somewhere down the road, a man on horseback had paused, watching the scene unfold. His coat was dusted from travel, his hat shadowing his face. But his eyes, sharp and searching, lingered on Clara longer than anyone else's. She didn't notice him then, too focused on finishing her work and salvaging what was left of her pride. But that moment, the girl who refused to bow, the man who silently watched, would change the course of her life. By sunset, the town's whispers had turned into gossip, and Clara was once again the topic of cruel amusement. But far from Willow Creek's main street, the rider who'd seen her stood outside his sprawling estate, thinking of the poor girl with the fire in her eyes. Elias Thornwell, the richest man in the West, had seen many women in his life, but none who carried herself like that. And somewhere deep inside him, a thought took root. My ranch needs a woman like her. The man who had paused on his horse that day was Elias Thornwell, known across 3 states as the Baron of the West. He was a name whispered with both awe and unease, a man whose fortune had been built on cattle, land, and iron will. His ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, thousands of acres of golden grass and rugged hills fenced by cedar and barbed wire. Yet for all his wealth, Elias lived like a ghost among his riches, burdened by a past he never spoke of. Years ago, before the money and the legend, Elias had been a husband and a father. His wife, Margaret, had been the only softness in his hard, disciplined world. She'd died giving birth to their only child, and the baby hadn't survived the night. From that moment, something in him had gone cold. He buried himself in work, in business, in endless miles of open land, anything to drown the silence that followed him wherever he went. By the time he returned to Willow Creek after nearly 5 years away, people said he had no heart left. He owned nearly half the valley, yet he rode alone. The townsfolk respected him, feared him even, but no one claimed to truly know him. That afternoon, as he reined in his horse near the general store, Elias hadn't intended to stop. He was merely passing through to check on a new shipment of supplies. But when he saw Clara Dawson standing on that wooden porch, holding her broom like a sword against the laughter of the women around her, something caught his attention. It wasn't pity that stirred in him. He'd seen hardship before. He'd known hunger himself as a young man. What struck him was the way she stood, proud and unbroken, in the face of humiliation. Her eyes burned with quiet defiance. Her chin lifted as if she were carved from the same stone as the mountains that ringed the horizon. For a long moment, Elias simply watched her. He saw the tattered hem of her dress, the calluses on her hands, the exhaustion in her shoulders. But more than that, he saw strength, the kind that no money could buy and no title could imitate. When Clara turned back to her sweeping, the moment passed, but it left an imprint in Elias's thoughts. He nudged his horse forward and rode on, yet his mind stayed behind on that dusty street. Back at Thornwell Ranch, the world seemed even quieter than usual. The servants greeted him stiffly as always, the foreman reported on the herds, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Crowley, reminded him that the upstairs rooms needed attending to after a recent storm. Elias nodded absently through their updates, his mind elsewhere. That evening, as he sat alone in his study, the fire crackling low, he found himself thinking again about the girl in town, the poor one, the one who refused to bow. He didn't even know her name, yet the memory of her eyes lingered. Perhaps it was because she reminded him of Margaret, before tragedy had worn both their souls thin. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the faint sounds of coyotes and the whisper of grass. "This place is too empty," he murmured to himself. He thought of the vast halls of Thornwell House, rooms once filled with laughter and music, now only dust and shadows. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitude pressing against him. He didn't need another servant. He didn't need another worker. What he needed, though he couldn't yet admit it, was someone who reminded him of what being alive felt like. And so, the next morning, Elias Thornwell made a quiet decision. He saddled his horse before dawn and rode back toward Willow Creek, toward the dusty store and the girl who had nothing, but carried herself as if she owned the sun. The next morning, Willow Creek was already stirring when Elias Thornwell rode into town. The sun had just broken over the horizon, spilling gold light across the dirt streets and waking the sleepy shopkeepers. His presence was impossible to miss. The Baron of the West was a man people whispered about, not one they expected to see at dawn, sitting astride a coal-black stallion in front of Henley's general store. Clara Dawson, broom in hand as always, froze when she saw him dismount. She recognized him instantly. Everyone did. He was wealth and power wrapped in a tailored coat and leather gloves, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. For a moment she thought she'd done something wrong, that perhaps she'd swept too close to his horse or blocked his way. But when he turned his sharp blue eyes toward her, she felt something shift. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice low and steady. Her heart jumped. He knew her name. "Yes, sir," she replied cautiously, clutching the broom handle like a lifeline. He studied her for a moment, not speaking right away. The silence stretched long enough for the townsfolk to start peering out their windows, curiosity drawing them like flies. Finally, he said, "I was in town yesterday. I saw how those girls spoke to you." Clara's cheeks burned. "It's nothing, sir. Folks talk." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "People talk everywhere, Miss Dawson. The difference is whether you listen." She didn't know what to say. No one ever spoke to her like that, not with that quiet kind of respect. Not even Mr. Henley. Elias's gaze softened, just slightly. "You're wasted in this town," he said. "You work hard, harder than most, but they'll never see it. They've already decided who you are." Clara's throat tightened. "And what am I, sir?" His answer was unexpected. "Someone who deserves better than this." He paused. "I have a ranch 15 miles west of here, Thornwell Ranch. It's large and it's been neglected since my old housekeeper passed. I need someone capable to run the household. I'm offering you the position." The broom nearly slipped from Clara's hands. "Me?" she stammered. "You want me to work at your ranch?" A flicker of amusement touched his eyes. "Unless there's another Miss Dawson I don't know about." The offer was absurd. Unbelievable. Her mind raced. She was a poor girl with no family, no references, no fine manners. The richest man in the West could have hired anyone. Why her? I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll think on it," Elias said, his tone gentle but firm. "I'll have my wagon in town tomorrow morning. If you're ready, I'll take you back with me." With a polite nod, he turned and mounted his horse, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The crowd that had gathered began to buzz the moment he disappeared down the road. "Did you hear that?" Millie Carter's voice rang out from across the street. "The Baron just offered her a job. The beggar girl." Laughter followed, harsh and jealous. But this time, Clara didn't shrink. She was too dazed to care. The world had tilted beneath her feet, and she didn't know whether she was standing on solid ground anymore. That night, she lay awake in her tiny shack, staring at the flickering light of her lamp. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Don't bow to cruelty. Maybe this was her chance to rise above it. Maybe the offer wasn't pity, but possibility. When the dawn came again, Clara folded her few belongings into a small cloth bundle. One spare dress, her father's locket, and a Bible with a cracked spine. As the Baron's wagon rolled into town just after sunrise, she stood waiting on the edge of the road, her heart hammering. Elias Thornwell saw her there, her eyes steady despite the fear she couldn't hide, and he felt something rare stir inside him, a quiet certainty. Without a word, he reached down a hand. She took it. And as the wagon rumbled toward Thornwell Ranch, the dusty town of Willow Creek, grew smaller behind her, until it was nothing but a blur on the horizon. The road to Thornwell Ranch wound through golden meadows and rolling hills that seemed to stretch on forever. Clara sat in the wagon beside Elias Thornwell, her hands clasped in her lap, too nervous to speak. The farther they rode from Willow Creek, the more unreal it all felt, like she had stepped out of her own life and into someone else's dream. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun hung high in the sky, painting the fields in shades of honey and rust. Clara's breath caught as she took in the sight of it. A sprawling house of pale stone and timber perched on a hill overlooking miles of open land. Barns stood tall in the distance. Smoke rose from a blacksmith's forge, and horses ran freely beyond the fences. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen. "This is Thornwell Ranch," Elias said, his voice quiet but proud. "It takes a good deal to keep it running. Mrs. Crowley, the old housekeeper, passed some months back. Things have fallen out of order since." Clara nodded, trying to hide her awe. "It's beautiful, sir." "Beautiful," he murmured, "but empty." Inside, the mansion was grand but lifeless. Dust coated the furniture, curtains hung heavy with neglect, and the scent of old wood and silence filled every corner. The servants, few and weary, stared as Clara entered. Whispers followed her down the hallway like shadows. She could almost hear their thoughts. "What's a poor girl like her doing here?" Elias introduced her with a few firm words. "This is Miss Dawson. She'll be managing the household. Show her respect." That silenced the murmurs, at least while he was in the room. Once Elias left to inspect the ranch grounds, Clara was left to face the great house on her own. She rolled up her sleeves and began where she always did, by working. The next days passed in a blur of sweeping, scrubbing, and polishing. Clara rose before dawn and worked until the moon was high. She aired out rooms long forgotten, scrubbed the grand staircase until it gleamed, and coaxed warmth back into the old kitchen with the smell of fresh bread. The servants, skeptical at first, began to watch her differently. She didn't order or scold. She worked beside them. When the youngest stable boy, Tommy, spilled a bucket of water and stammered in fear, she simply smiled and handed him a towel. "Accidents happen," she said softly. It was small, but it was enough to make him beam. By the end of the week, even Mrs. Crowley's old assistant, a stern woman named Martha, grudgingly admitted, She's got spirit, that one. Elias noticed, too. Though he spent most of his days in the fields or the stables, he often found excuses to pass through the house. Once he paused at the doorway of the dining room to watch Clara adjusting the long, dusty drapes. Sunlight streamed through the clean glass, casting her in golden light. For the first time in years, that room, once filled with sorrow, seemed to breathe again. "Mr. Thornwell?" she asked, startled when she turned and saw him watching. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of himself. "You've done well," he said simply. "The house looks different." Clara smiled shyly. "A little light can change everything." That night, as he sat alone in his study, Elias found himself replaying those words. A little light can change everything. He poured himself a glass of whiskey but didn't touch it. He could still hear her laughter echo faintly from the kitchen down the hall. In the weeks that followed, Thornwell Ranch began to transform. Not just the house, but the people in it. The servants smiled more. The horses were better tended. The fires burned warmer, and for the first time in years, Elias Thornwell found himself returning home each evening, not to a tomb of memories, but to a living place again, one that smelled of baking bread, clean linens, and something else he couldn't name. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. The longer Clara stayed at Thornwell Ranch, the more it began to feel like a world of its own, separate from the gossiping town, separate from her past life of hunger and humiliation. Yet beneath its beauty there was an ache that clung to the walls like dust, the quiet sorrow of a man who had lost everything. Elias Thornwell was a man of few words. He spoke little, smiled less, and spent most days out on horseback, overseeing the ranch hands or tending to business deals. But at night, Clara would sometimes see the light burning in his study long past midnight. Through the open doorway, she'd glimpse him sitting alone, staring into the fire as though it might speak to him. One evening, while cleaning the upstairs hall, Clara discovered a small wooden door she hadn't noticed before. It led to a narrow attic room. Inside, dust motes floated through the light from a single cracked window. Boxes lined the walls, stacked high and untouched for years. Out of habit, she began to tidy, but then her hand brushed against a small trunk near the corner. Its lid was half open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age and tied with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a child's toy horse, hand-carved from oak, and a woman's bonnet trimmed with lace. Clara froze. These weren't just old belongings. These were memories. A sudden sound behind her made her start. "You shouldn't be in here," Elias said quietly from the doorway. Clara turned, heart pounding. I'm sorry, Mr. Thornwell, I didn't mean to intrude." "I was cleaning," and his expression was unreadable, but the pain in his eyes told her everything. He stepped forward and gently closed the trunk. "Those things belong to my wife and son," he said softly. "They've been gone for many years." Her breath caught. "I didn't know. Most don't, and I prefer it that way." He paused, his voice rough around the edges. "I thought if I left this room untouched, some part of them might stay. Foolish, isn't it?" Clara shook her head. "Not foolish," she said gently. "Just human." For a long moment, silence filled the attic, thick, heavy, but not cold. Then Elias let out a weary sigh and sat on an old wooden chair. "Margaret loved this house," he murmured. "She wanted to fill it with life. I failed her. After she died, everything turned to dust. I let it." Clara hesitated, then stepped closer. "You didn't fail her, sir. You survived her loss. That takes strength." He looked up, surprised by her words. In her eyes, he didn't see pity, only understanding. Something inside him cracked, a small piece of the armor he'd built around his heart. After that night, something shifted between them. Elias began to seek her company, though he pretended otherwise. He'd find reasons to pass through the kitchen while she cooked, or to linger by the stables when she visited the horses. Sometimes they'd share quiet conversations at dusk, talking not about wealth or work, but about the land, the stars, and the way the prairie wind could make a person feel both free and lonely. One evening, a storm rolled in suddenly, shaking the house with thunder and wind. The power went out, and Clara rushed to close the shutters. In the dim glow of lanterns, she found Elias standing by the window, staring into the storm. "Every storm reminds me of the night I lost them," he admitted. his voice barely above a whisper. Without thinking, Clara stepped closer and laid a trembling hand on his arm. "You don't have to face it alone," she said. He looked down at her, and for a heartbeat neither spoke. The thunder rolled outside, but in that quiet space between them, something unspoken grew, something fragile and frightening and real. Elias reached up as if to take her hand fully, but then stopped himself. His jaw tightened and he turned away. "You should rest," he said quietly. "The storm will pass." But as she walked away, her heart racing, Clara knew the truth. Some storms don't pass. They just change shape, and sometimes they look like love. By spring, Thornwell Ranch had changed. The once silent halls now rang with life. Fires burned bright. Laughter carried through the kitchen, and even the ranch hands worked with a lighter spirit. At the center of it all was Clara Dawson. Her hands brought order. Her warmth brought peace. But peace, as Clara soon learned, rarely lasts long, especially when envy has ears. It began quietly, with whispers that drifted through the town of Willow Creek. The folks who'd once mocked Clara for being poor now found a new reason to talk. "Did you hear?" The women whispered behind their lace fans. "That Dawson girl's living in the Baron's house now. Alone with him, no less. She's clever, that one," another voice said. "Poor once rich now. Must have used more than a mop to win the Baron's favor." Laughter followed, sharp as a knife. At first, Clara didn't know. Thornwell Ranch was far enough from town that gossip took time to reach her. But one afternoon, when she rode in with Tommy, the stable boy, to pick up supplies, she felt the eyes on her, the stares, the smirks, the pity disguised as politeness. Mrs. Henley at the general store smiled too sweetly. "Well, Miss Dawson," she said, drawing out the name. Or should I say Mrs. Thornwell? Surely the Baron must have made it official by now. Clara's heart thudded painfully. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am." "Oh, of course you don't," Mrs. Henley replied, feigning innocence. "Still, folks do wonder why a young woman spends her nights in a rich man's house. It's not proper, you understand." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks. She gathered her things and left in silence, her hands trembling. But by the time she reached the ranch, humiliation had turned to anger. That evening, Elias found her outside the barn, brushing down one of the mares with sharp, angry strokes. "You're quiet tonight," he said softly. She didn't look at him. "People are talking," he frowned. "About what?" "About us." The word came out bitter. "They think I'm here because we—" She broke off, too embarrassed to finish. Elias's expression hardened. "Let me guess. Willow Creek's finest have decided they know my business." She nodded. "I can't stop them. But I don't want to shame your name, sir. If my being here, if it causes trouble, I'll leave." At that, his jaw set. "You'll do no such thing." His tone left no room for argument. "Clara, this ranch runs because of you. The staff follow your lead. The house is alive again because of you. I won't have you run off because a few fools in town can't keep their tongues still." "But—" He stepped closer, eyes blazing with quiet fury. "Let them talk," he said. "They don't know what they speak of. They never did. If they mock you, they mock me, and I don't take kindly to that." The words hit her like a thunderclap. Elias Thornwell, the richest, proudest man in the West, had just placed her reputation under his protection. "Mr. Thornwell," she whispered. "You don't have to—" "I do," he interrupted, his voice softening. "Because no one mocks the woman under my roof." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the air between them changed. It wasn't a master defending a servant, nor a rich man pitying the poor. It was something deeper, steadier. The next week, Elias rode into Willow Creek himself. When the townsfolk saw him dismount in front of the general store, silence swept through the street. He looked every bit the Baron, tall, commanding, his shadow long in the sun. "I hear my name, and Miss Dawson's, are being tossed about like cards in a saloon," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "Consider this your warning. Speak falsehoods again, and I'll take it as a personal insult." No one dared meet his eyes. Even Mrs. Henley turned pale. When he returned home that evening, Clara was waiting on the porch, worry written across her face. He removed his hat and met her gaze with quiet certainty. "They won't bother you again," he said simply. She swallowed hard. "You didn't have to defend me." "Yes, I did," he said. Then, after a pause, "Because you belong here, Clara. Let them think what they will. I know the truth." And though neither spoke the word aloud, They both felt it trembling between them. Love. Summer arrived with dry winds that scorched the grasslands and cracked the earth beneath Thornwell Ranch. The days grew longer, the work harder, and the nights restless. Yet despite the heat, there was a kind of peace, fragile, but real. Clara and Elias had found an unspoken rhythm together. She ran the household with quiet grace, and he, though still guarded, sought her presence more and more. Sometimes they would walk the fields in the evening when the sky burned orange. He'd talk of cattle and crops, she of dreams she'd never dared to share. Those moments, soft and simple, made the grand, lonely ranch feel like a home again. But peace, like all good things, is often tested. Among the ranch hands was a man named Rufus Hale, broad-shouldered and bitter. He'd been loyal to Elias for years, but carried jealousy like a sickness. Once he'd hoped to climb higher, become foreman, maybe even Elias's right hand. But ever since Clara's arrival, things had changed. She'd won Elias's trust and the affection of everyone on the ranch. Rufus saw it as an insult, an intrusion. "Fancy little beggar," he muttered one night over whiskey, "thinking she can take what ain't hers." It was a dry August evening when the trouble began. The air smelled of dust and tension. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread, when Tommy burst in, breathless. "Miss Dawson! The stables, they're on fire!" The world tilted. Clara ran outside, the wind hot and sharp against her face. In the distance, orange flames licked the dark sky, swallowing the wooden stables whole. Horses screamed and kicked against their stalls, panicked. Ranch hands rushed with buckets of water, shouting orders over the roar of the fire. "Where's Mr. Thornwell?" Clara cried. "Out riding the south fields." Tommy shouted back. Without a second thought, Clara hitched up her skirts and ran straight toward the flames. The heat seared her face. The smoke clawed at her throat. But she didn't stop. She grabbed a blanket, soaked it in water, and threw it over her head before plunging inside. The air was thick, suffocating. She could barely see, but she heard the terrified cries of a horse trapped at the far end of the stable. It was Elias's favorite stallion, Ash, rearing and kicking wildly. "Easy, boy, easy," she gasped, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. She cut through the reins with a knife and pulled hard, guiding the panicked horse toward the open door. The beast resisted, then finally bolted free into the night. Clara stumbled out behind him, collapsing to her knees, just as Elias thundered in on horseback, his face pale with fear. He jumped off before his horse even stopped moving. "Clara!" She looked up, soot covering her skin, eyes red from smoke. "The horses, they're safe," she managed before falling against him. Elias caught her in his arms, cradling her as the fire crackled behind them. "You could have died," he said hoarsely. His voice broke on the words. "I couldn't let them burn," she whispered weakly. "Not after all they've meant to you." He pulled her closer, his voice trembling. "It's not the horses I care about, it's you." For a long moment they said nothing. The flames hissed and spit, and the night filled with the smell of ash. Then Elias lifted her chin, his thumb brushing soot from her cheek. "Clara," he said, the words raw and unguarded, "you belong with me. Not as my servant, not as a guest. You belong to my heart." Tears blurred her vision. "Elias!" He silenced her with a soft, trembling touch. "I've been blind too long," he murmured. "You've given this place life again. You've given me life again." Behind them, the last of the fire died to embers. Ranch hands worked in silence, sensing something sacred unfolding. As dawn crept over the horizon, Elias carried Clara back toward the house, her head resting against his shoulder. The first light of morning touched the ranch, revealing the ruin of the stables, but also something reborn in their hearts. For years, Thornwell Ranch had been built on land, labor, and wealth. But now, for the first time, it had something richer, love that had survived the fire. The fire that nearly destroyed Thornwell Ranch became, in time, the very thing that rebuilt it. Though the stables were lost, no lives were taken, and from the ashes rose something neither Clara Dawson nor Elias Thornwell could have imagined: a future. For several days after the fire, Clara remained confined to her room, recovering from smoke and exhaustion. Elias checked on her often, despite his duties. The servants noticed how gently he spoke when he was near her door, how his voice, once hard as iron, softened whenever he said her name. By the fifth morning, Clara insisted on returning to work. "I'm not an invalid," she told him with a faint smile as he found her in the kitchen, apron tied neatly once again. He frowned. "You nearly died, Clara. The ranch can wait." She looked up at him, her expression calm but determined. "The ranch never waits, Mr. Thornwell. You taught me that." He couldn't argue. Instead, he gave her a look filled with something unspoken. Pride, tenderness, and perhaps a little awe, and simply nodded. "Then at least promise me you'll take it slow." "I'll try," she said, though they both knew she'd keep going until the job was done. Over the weeks that followed, the ranch came alive with rebuilding. The workers, inspired by Clara's courage, worked harder than ever. New timbers were raised, roofs hammered into place, and life slowly returned to its rhythm. But amid the noise of labor and renewal, something quieter bloomed between Clara and Elias, a love steady as the land itself. The townsfolk of Willow Creek, of course, had much to say. They watched from a distance as the Baron's carriage began making fewer appearances in town, and as letters came stamped with Thornwell's seal, signed Mrs. Clara Thornwell. Some called it scandal, others called it destiny, but Clara didn't care what they said anymore. The girl who once swept floors for pennies now walked the ranch with confidence, her skirts brushing golden grass, her laughter carried on the wind. The men tipped their hats when she passed. The women of the house sought her counsel. Even the horses seemed calmer when she was near. Still, she never forgot where she'd come from, or the promise her father had made her give. Don't ever bow to cruelty. One afternoon, months after the fire, a small crowd gathered at the edge of the ranch. Elias had invited the townspeople to a harvest gathering, a chance to thank them for their help during the rebuilding. Clara stood beside him, nervous but proud, her hand resting lightly on his arm. When they rode together into town that morning to greet the last of the guests, all eyes turned toward them. The whispers came again, but this time they were different. Admiration replaced envy. Respect replaced ridicule. At the town square, Elias dismounted and offered his hand to her. His deep voice carried easily through the crowd. "Some of you may remember when this woman had nothing," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But she had more courage than anyone I've ever known. And now she's given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope." The crowd fell silent. Clara's throat tightened and tears pricked her eyes. She wanted to speak, but Elias gently squeezed her hand as if to say she didn't need to. His words had already said everything. Later that night, under the wide western sky, Clara stood on the porch of Thornwell House, watching the stars shimmer over the plains. Elias came to stand beside her, his arms sliding around her shoulders. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The life you had before?" She smiled faintly. "I miss my father," she said, "but not the hunger, not the loneliness." Then she looked up at him, her voice tender but sure. "You gave me a home, Elias. Not just these walls, the heart of it." He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "No, Clara," he said softly. "You gave it to me." In the distance, the rebuilt stables gleamed under the moonlight, and the wind carried the scent of new hay and promise. Once, Clara Dawson had been the girl no one wanted, the one the world mocked for being poor. But now she stood where she belonged, not as a servant, not as a charity case, but as the woman of Thornwell Ranch, the wife, the heart, and the love that even the richest man in the West could not live without. And in the silence of the night, beneath the stars of a forgiving sky, she whispered to herself the truth that had carried her through it all. You can lose everything you own, and still have everything that matters.